My name is Derek Simon. I'm a lawyer at Burchells LLP. I practice Aboriginal, commercial, and environmental law, and I've spent the last decade working with First Nations and Inuit groups here in Atlantic Canada on various legal issues. Absolutely. I mean, land is a critical driver of economic growth anywhere, on reserve, off reserve. Businesses need access to land in order to operate. They need access to land in order to finance. Banks and other financial groups are always looking for collateral for loans, and land can be a very important thing, piece of collateral in the financing process. So yeah, it's critical for businesses to have access to land. It's very important. Currently, the reserve land base in Canada is only about 0.2% of the entire country is in reserve land, and that's simply not enough land for First Nations to grow and prosper. So too much of the land has already been taken away, and returning some of that land to First Nations ownership is critical to social, to cultural, and to economic success. A lot of the preserved land that is there is quite marginal in terms of economic potential. The government often shows the worst land they could find to put First Nations on, and so getting access to land that's in urban areas and areas where there are economic opportunities is going to be critical to success. The specific land claims process is an important part of that. Treaty negotiations, any process that sees land returned to First Nations ownership. I mean, I think one of the big problems that First Nations face out of the gate when trying to develop reserve land is some of the myths or perceptions that exist in the non-Indigenous community. There's a lot of myths about reserves that I think really hinder the ability of First Nations to use their land and to pursue business opportunities. You've got myths that range from there's absolutely no rules on reserve, so anything goes, and there's too many rules on reserve. It's too bureaucratic. You can't get anything done there. Neither of those is really true. The reality is there's a different set of rules that apply to reserve land, but if you know those rules and you know how to use those rules, the economic opportunities are there. Other myths that exist include the idea that no one has any interest in reserve land, that it's all held in common and no one can use it for anything, and that's not true either. I mean, there's a lot of ways of creating interest in reserve land that allow people to pursue business opportunities. There's certificates of possession, and CP holders can enter into leases themselves. So there's business potential there. You can designate reserve land for leasing, and there's opportunities there. You look at a place like Millbrook First Nation and what they've done by designating a portion of their land base for leasing, and have developed a whole commercial power center around that. So the opportunities are there if you understand the particular laws that apply on reserve. One of the challenges that does exist on reserve is access to capital for financing. So as I mentioned earlier, it can be hard for businesses to get money without land or other collateral to put up. And some of the rules in the Indian Act do place a lot of restrictions that make it very difficult to get financing on reserve. And so that is a real challenge that communities face. So you got to overcome some of the myths and the perceptions that exist out there, and then face some of the real challenges, such as access to capital. In terms of ways to overcome those challenges, education is a big one. When you're dealing with myths, you've got to educate the broader community about the opportunities that do exist for doing business with First Nations. There's a certain amount of capacity building that has to be done in communities, and tapping into some of the capacity that's already there in terms of community members that that do have business experience and do have business aspirations. And partnership is an important one, taking the opportunity to learn from established businesses. And a lot of First Nations have been quite successful in partnering with outside businesses, learning the ropes of a particular industry, and then going on to pursue other opportunities themselves. So partnerships, I think, are critical to overcoming some of those obstacles. In terms of First Nations that have been successful in overcoming them, I mentioned Millbrook earlier and what they've done with their power center, which is very impressive. Member 2 is another great success story that combines a lot of those things. They've got some successful outside partnerships. They found some unique ways to lease out their reserve land base and bring in outside businesses like Tim Hortons and others to the reserve, which is great. Convention center, hotel. They've created a climate of good governance and sort of a positive environment for business, and that's another critical way I think that these challenges can be overcome is, through good governance, through stable government. Business gradually develops the confidence that they can do business with First Nations. Another success story in the making, I think, Glooscap First Nation in the Valley. They've got some great projects in the works, including their Glooscap Landing project, which is a highway development project, and I think it's got huge potential. So there's a lot of exciting things going on with First Nations here in Nova Scotia. Sure. I mean, the types of business structures on reserve are basically the same types of business structures that are available off reserve. The difference being, again, because the rules are a little different, the pros and cons of each are a little different. So your classic is just an unincorporated business, or what we call a sole proprietorship. And some First Nations operate their businesses that way. Member 2 is a prime example, where their businesses essentially operate as a department within the First Nation. And as a way to structure things on reserve, that's actually, in many ways, a perfectly sensible way to do things. You've got some protection from liability, and you've got the advantage of the tax exemption. And those are two of kind of the key driving factors when you're choosing a business structure. The big concerns are usually liability, so protecting the community or the business owner from liability, and making sure you minimize your tax obligations. The added consideration, I think, in First Nations communities is you got to make sure you've got a business structure that fits the culture, the aspirations, and the governance style of that community. And so you look at the different business structures. As I mentioned, sole proprietorship, a lot of First Nations structure their business that way. If you're looking for some added protection from liability, you can incorporate, and some First Nations do that. They set up a for-profit development corporation, or incorporate each business separately. And again, for a First Nation to do that, that makes a lot of sense, as long as that business operates on reserve. If it's 100% owned by the First Nation, it continues to be tax exempt, provides some additional protection from liability, which is helpful, and creates a bit of a governance structure for the businesses. Where the corporation is a bit of a challenge is for individual business owners. So if an individual member of a First Nation incorporates their business on reserve, all of a sudden they're going to get hit with a tax bill, and a lot of people don't want to see that. So a corporation for an on-reserve business owned by a First Nations individual is usually a less than optimal structure. Some First Nations use nonprofit corporations as part of their business structure on reserve. So if you've got a business that's maybe got some more social objectives, or it serves some nonprofit objectives on reserve, you might create a development corporation that's a nonprofit corporation, and takes the money it makes from the businesses and puts it back into the community. The only thing to be careful about there is it can tie your hands a little bit in terms of what you can use the money for. So you can run a business through a nonprofit corporation, but you've got to make sure that that money's being put back into whatever the nonprofit objectives of the corporation are. So that's something to consider. A structure we're starting to see a lot more in the region, and this is more for off-reserve businesses. And I think it's important to emphasize that while there's lots of opportunities on reserve, there's an increasing amount of opportunities for First Nations to do business off reserve as well, whether it's wind farms, whether it's partnerships with other businesses in the community. There's an increasing amount of First Nations economic activity taking place off reserve, which is great, but the considerations off reserve are slightly different again. So we're starting to see limited partnerships used a bit more for off reserve business, and that allows that balances kind of protection from liability with being able to stream a lot of the money that the business makes back to the First Nation tax exempt. So a corporation is not a great structure for a First Nation doing business off reserve, but a limited partnership is. So there's a lot of opportunity there for businesses.